Ending the night here with some reading. So again, this is going to be module 1 from the test above, practice test 3 from the College Board site, the 6 paper tests. Yeah, this is going to be part 1 of the reading. So again, these tests are always going to start out with vocab. Usually the first couple ones aren't too bad. They're a nice little warm up. So let's go through them. So starting with number 1 here, we have in the early 1800s, this scholar created the first script or writing system for an indigenous language in the United States. Let me make this look a little nicer. Okay. Because it represented the sounds of spoken Cherokee so accurately, his script was easy to learn and thus quickly achieved blank use. So already positive, right? As I'm going through these passages, I'm always trying to follow not only positive, negative connotation, but am I continuing or transitioning, right? So kind of two different things there. This is all positive, no transition, right? So I'm looking for another positive thing here. It achieved blank use. The first thing that came into my mind is like widespread use. If it's accurate and it's easy to learn, a lot of people should be using it. I already see that in A, right? Let's see if we can finish the passage here. Over 90% of the Cherokee people could read and write. So yeah, 90% is going to be a lot, right? Contrast it with like a really small percentage. If it was like 5%, right? 90%, they're trying to emphasize a lot or widespread. I always like to go through the rest of the words too, just for extra practice. So if I looked at the rest of the words, careful just means to be, you know, weary, meticulous, not kind of all over the place. Unintended. So if you intended to do something, think like intent, you meant to do something. So unintended would be like you didn't mean to do it. Infrequent, same thing. You've probably heard of like frequent or frequency. That's doing something maybe a lot or in a habitual or, you know, with a habit. So infrequent would be like not in a habitual way, not very frequent, not a lot, right? So again, yeah, these first couple just really good warm-up vocab problems. Number 2 off to the side here, I'll scroll it a little bit. And let's go through it. When Mexican-American archaeologist Maria published her research paper on sculptures found at ancient indigenous city of that place in present-day Mexico, other researchers readily blanked her work as groundbreaking. So same as the last passage. Am I transitioning? Am I staying positive? Am I staying negative? This sounds positive. This sounds positive, and it's going to continue to be positive. Groundbreaking is like a really good thing. If you're doing research and there's kind of like 2 outcomes, right? You don't accomplish anything, so kind of neutral, or you accomplish a lot, right? Groundbreaking, it's something significant is happening, and we can keep going. This recognition, right? Someone receives recognition for doing something positive, stemmed from her convincing, so it's convincing people, there's evidence, demonstration that the sculptures were much older than previously thought. Okay, so we're looking for a nice positive answer here. Researchers readily acknowledged her work. That would mean they saw it and they were like, oh, that is really good research, right? Like it came within their view, right? They read the work, they acknowledged the work. Insured, that would be something like an insurance company would ensure that someone was going to receive benefits for something, right? So not really what the researchers are doing here. Definitely not denied, because we're looking for positive words, right? And underestimated, another negative word. So that's another important thing to touch on, is just getting the connotation, like, hey, do we want a positive or a negative word here? Just knowing it's a positive kind of tone, I can get rid of C and D, and it's going to be acknowledged for this one. Really good warm-up problem so far. Let's try to finish page 2 as well. So another thing to kind of note is as you go through these problems, you'll see that some are underlined and some aren't. The ones that are underlined are going to be a little bit harder. So if you're looking for just the hardest problems, go ahead and kind of skip through these videos to the ones I have underlined. But jumping into number 3 here, let's see what we got. Like other tribal nations, this one is self-governing. Its national council generates laws regulating aspects of community life such as land use and healthcare. Sounds great. While the principal chief and cabinet officials blank those laws, maybe like enforce, right? Enforce those laws by devising policies and administering services in accordance. So again, I mean, you could say it's positively connotated. I'm mostly drawing positives to show that I'm not transitioning. So what I mean by that is, and I'll highlight this in other passages too, I'm starting in a direction and I'm ending in that same direction, as opposed to starting in a direction and then ending up in a different direction. So sometimes I'll use positive, negative, not that I'm necessarily going from like a positive tone to a negative tone, but that I'm in two different directions. And then we're looking for a word that kind of does that, but not in this case. We are flowing. We are looking for a word like enforce, right? So I go through number 3 here and I see implement right off the bat. So remember that implement is going to be like, if you were working as a manager at a factory and you implemented new roles, you would be putting those roles to use, right? So if you're implementing those laws, you'd be kind of putting those laws to use. So A is already a really good answer. To presume something is going to be kind of similar to like assume something, not really what they're doing here, right? They're putting laws into use. Improvise would be like if something went wrong and you were trying to, in a hurry, like figure out something that could work. Not doing any improvising here. And mimic. So mimic's like copying. They're not doing any copying here. It's going to be A, excellent answer. I jump down to number 4 here. Let's see what we got here. In the indigenous intercropping system, known as the Three Sisters, maize, squash, and beans form a blank. So some sort of word describing the web of relations between these three, right? Let's finish the context. Maize provides structure, squash vines cover the soil, discouraging competition, and beans aid the two by enriching the soil. So again, a very, very positive kind of continuing word here, right? There's a beneficial, there is a relationship between these three where they're all helping each other, right? So again, I'm looking for that answer down below. Indecipherable, no. So the context with indecipherable, and this is another good way to practice. If I go backwards with each answer choice, if my answer was A, they would have described something like hieroglyphics, like something where these archaeologists were trying to figure out what it was and they couldn't. It was indecipherable, unable to be understood, right? Ornamental is going to describe like, imagine like, I guess kind of similar to archaeologists, say they discovered a new tomb and a pyramid and the room was ornamental. It was covered in decorations, ornaments, right? Think like ornaments on a tree. So not really talking about decorations, a beneficial relationship, right? Obscure. So obscure, they would have highlighted that it was very rare, that it was very odd, right? Like it didn't make sense. It sounds like it makes a lot of sense, right? They all kind of benefit each other, right? So it looks like I'm not getting a word like benefiting, but I am getting a word like intricate. So intricate's going to be like complex, a complex web of relations. This thing does this thing does this, and this other thing does. So these three things do these three completely separate functions. So whether they used a word like beneficial or they used a word like complex, because you have these three things doing such different tasks, both fit here, and they would never have included a word like beneficial or intricate because they both kind of fit. So D, intricate for this one. I go back up to number 5, and this is going to be our first good one. I see that it's underlined, and let's try to see what's going on in the context, right? So the artisans of this guild in Nigeria typically, so that's already starting us off in a direction, they typically blank the bronze and brass casting techniques that have been passed down. So they're typically using these techniques that have been passed down through their families. But transition. So this is where you might see me do, like, maybe we started off positive and then now we're changing to negative. Not that it's a positive and negative thing happening, but positive represents I'm going in one direction, and then negative represents I'm going in the opposite direction. So they typically follow these techniques, but they don't strictly observe every tradition. So while 80% of the time, and I like using percentages too, maybe 80% of the time they follow these techniques, and then I would write maybe like 20% of the time, they don't strictly observe every tradition. For example, included in this 20%, guild members now use air conditioning motors instead of handheld bellows, right? So that's not going to be passed down from the 14th century. Air conditioning is going to be a more recent thing. So they typically use. Do you see how, like, I'm not even looking at the answering choices a lot? I'm trying to fill in the blank with my own context, and it makes answering much easier. So they typically experiment with? No, they are typically following, using, right? A very direct word, adhere to. So that might be an odd word for you. Think of like you would adhere to like roles, right? If you're in school, you're adhering to like you're trying to be at a class on time. You have to be at certain classes at certain times. Just means you're following the roles. So typically adhering to these techniques fits perfectly. They're not trying to improve upon them, right? This is still early in the passage where they're still following them before they mention maybe improving or changing certain things, right? So again, we're not at the improvement part yet. And grapple with is an interesting phrase. So you would grapple with like a problem. If that just means you're kind of like, say you were avoiding the problem, now you're grappling with it. That means you're challenging it. You're trying to change it, right? Not what they're doing here. They're just following these techniques, right? So B for this one, another really good example. And I think we'll finish up with number 6, another, excellent practice vocabulary question here. Let's see what they got. Some economic historians blank that late 19th and early 20th century households experienced an economy of scale when it came to food purchases. Maybe they're going to elaborate on that a little bit. And that's what this double hyphen does. It's kind of like an emphasis. They assumed that large households spent less on food per person than did small households. So we have our intro, we have our claim. How do they follow this up? This economist showed, however, so already I know what they're going to say. Remember that however is changing. If this was described in a certain way, it is now going to be described in a different way. So it's really important we follow these transitions, that a close look at the available data disproves that supposition. So supposition sounds fancy, but just remember that sounds like suppose. If you suppose something, you're kind of guessing, you're kind of assuming, right? I suppose it's not going to rain tomorrow. It's not necessarily based on any evidence, right? Kind of like hearsay, like maybe you heard it's not going to rain, but you don't have like the weather data to prove it. So that might match up here because we know these guys were wrong, right? Maybe they assumed that these late 19th and early 20th century households, they assumed the large households spent less on food, and this other guy proved them wrong, right? So it looks like with a lot of these harder vocab questions, we're looking for that synonym. It's going to be supposed, think assumed, think like not evidence-based. So I go through my answers here, and I'm going to start at the bottom because I think it's easier. Regretted. So they regretted that they said these things. We don't have enough, maybe like later in our passage, they would have provided evidence for they regretted they were wrong in making this assumption, but we don't have that context yet. Questioned. So it almost seems like the economist, this guy down here, questioned their assumption. Remember that questioning and assuming would be really antonyms. They're not questioning whether these larger households spent less money than the small households. They're assuming they did. So kind of the opposite of C, not going to work here, right? And then I look at contrived. So contrived, again, another fancy word. It's nice to try to refresh on some of these words. You can use Quizlet for some of these SAT word banks. So contrived, just try to think of like as opposed to something happening naturally, like maybe snowing at a ski resort. Contrived is causing it to happen deliberately. So instead of natural snow, you're producing your own snow at a ski resort. So that would be contrived snow. I don't think that's what the historians are doing here. They're not doing something like unnaturally that normally would have been natural. They are assuming, they're supposing, they're surmising, right? Something that's not necessarily based on evidence, more like conjecture. So A is going to be the perfect fit here. Practice your vocab, go over your Quizlet word banks, and master these kind of 6 paper test vocab problems, Perfect.